Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I am president of the City Club's Board of Directors. To quote from one of the greatest documents ever written, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." That, of course, is the Second Amendment ratified on December 15, 1791 as part of the Bill of Rights to the Constitution of the United States. Those words and what they mean continue to be discussed and debated in courtrooms among legislators and in everyday conversation among citizens who embrace freedom but don't always agree on how freedom should be exercised. Of course, the debate intensifies on the national level when events such as the assassination attempt in Washington, D.C. against President Reagan on March 30, 1981, or in Tucson, Arizona, against Congressman Giffords on January 8, 2011, occur. Today we hear from two sides on the subject of concealed weapons and firearms generally. Jeff Garvas is president and founder of the Board of Directors of Ohioans for Concealed Carry, or OFCC, whose website describes the organizational mission as, quote, "a grassroots political activist organization." When founded, the primary goal of OFCC was getting concealed carry passed into law in Ohio. With that accomplished, the OFCC's mission became to refine the concealed carry law and to expand and preserve the rights of all gun owners in Ohio, close quote. Toby Hoover is executive director of the Ohio Coalition Against Gun Violence, whose website describes the organizational mission as, quote, "to increase safety in Ohio in regards to firearms." The coalition educates about gun homicides, suicides, and unintentional deaths and injuries. The coalition supports and encourages local, state, and federal legislation to reduce the accessibility of firearms in our communities and families. If you were counting, you will notice I use almost exactly the same number of words from each website. So consistent with the City Club of Cleveland tradition, we have diverse views about to be represented on our panel, which will be moderated by Phil Calabrese, who's a partner at the law firm Squire Sanders. So I'll now turn the program over to Phil.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the City Club for hosting today's debate. It's always great to be at the Citadel Free Speech on timely topics such as this, where we can come together and have fruitful discussion on controversial topics without being disagreeable about it. So with that, we'll turn things over to our panelists today. We flipped a coin before coming out here, and Ms. Hoover won, and so she elected the kick. So Mr. Garvas will speak first for approximately 7 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the City Club of Cleveland, Ms. Hoover, as well as our moderator today for having us here. The introduction of me did a really good job of taking a good chunk of my introduction speech out, so I'm going to jump right into the issue at hand. Quite often, we are told that the gun lobby is a powerful beast funded by the industry and of firearms. And Ohioans for Concealed Carry is absolutely not funded by any industry. We're not funded by any special interest group. We don't get any money from the NRA. In fact, we actually try to raise funds for the NRA. Comparing our organization to Ms. Hoover's, we have only our members and our supporters to count on, whereas organizations like the Joyce Foundation spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to encourage gun control organizations to do what they do in the states. Nobody within our organization collects a salary. We are purely volunteers. But today's debate about gun control requires that we define what gun control is. Gun control is really thousands and thousands of laws at the state and federal level. These laws are controlling what individuals can do. And by definition, criminals break laws and don't pay attention to them. So when we look at gun registration or limitations on where you can take a firearm, the people that are going to listen to that are people like me, people like the rest of us here in this room for the most part. The people who are not going to obey laws are the criminals. So when we pass gun control, what we're really talking about is people control. And to a certain extent, we're talking about gun owner control. And to expect us to say that limiting what law-abiding gun owners are going to do or can do is somehow going to prevent criminals and madmen from doing things that none of us want to see happen is really kind of like a pipe dream. So, on a granular level, if you look at just criminals in general, in prisons, they admit they don't care what these laws say. They don't care who says they can and can't have a gun, and they're going to get them one way or another. What I find interesting, though, is when gun control proponents come out and admit what they're doing isn't really being successful. Last month, Dan Baum, a former staff writer for The New Yorker, penned an amazingly forthcoming op-ed. It was in the Huffington Post, and I took a paragraph out of it that I'd like to read. As a liberal Democrat, I worry about the damage we might do by rushing toward a fresh raft of gun control laws. It's very hard to demonstrate that most of them, registration, waiting periods, one-gun-a-month laws, closing the gun show loophole, large-capacity magazine restrictions, assault rifle bans, have ever saved a life. It's a hard thing to accept, but in a country of 350 million privately owned guns, the people who are inclined to do bad things with guns will always be able to get them. One might as well combat air crashes by repealing gravity. When you can't prove that gun control works, you have to change the topic. So, for instance, look at Cleveland. The city of Cleveland has been prohibited from registering firearms for some years now because the state has entered the realm of gun laws, and they claim that they have preemption. The courts have backed that up. During 2010, Cleveland issued a press release announcing where and when you could go register a firearm. The media in Cleveland picked it up, printed it, advertised where you could do it, and nobody called them out, nobody called the city of Cleveland out to point out that there's nothing in Ohio law, there's nothing in Cleveland law that can compel you to register a gun. You may have heard that our organization is passing a bill to allow guns in bars. I'm here to tell you today that if you believe that, you've been fooled by the anti-gun crowd and many police unions in Ohio. The legislation, which was recently reintroduced in the House, specifically prohibits you to be in possession of a firearm while consuming alcohol. While it does remove the felony conviction or the felony crime of possessing a gun in a Ruby Tuesdays or a Applebee's or any other restaurant that happens to sell alcohol. Police unions began coming out and saying that we want to put guns in bars. What they didn't tell you is that in 2007, they changed the law in Ohio that says any police officer in the state of Ohio can be in a bar, consume alcohol, and be in possession of their gun regardless of what their department says. Our legislation prohibits mixing guns with alcohols. These tactics turn the debate into an obfuscation of the facts. Instead of debating what's actually in the legislation, the subject has been changed to guns and alcohol. We've never even proposed that. According to JustFacts.com, quoting a Gallup poll, 42% of households polled indicate they own firearms. These numbers need to be taken as underreported because most gun owners are never going to admit that they own a gun to a random survey taker on a telephone. Gun control advocates have long used scare tactics combined with manipulated statistics to scare the public and politicians into following their gun banning agenda. One slogan they like to use is that in homes with guns, the homicide of a household member is almost 3 times more likely to occur than in homes without guns. This study has been repeated for decades because it sounds really concerning to people who don't know much about firearms. But if you look at it, it's like saying that if you look in a bunch of homes and you find Diet Pop in the refrigerator, there must be people overweight in that house. It's a horribly crafted research approach to come up with an example where the conclusion was perceived before the research began. Every time the stats have been challenged by doctors and peers, because the original author was a doctor in an ER, his statistics have been reduced and reduced and reduced, and his claim has been reduced. In the end, he inevitably admitted that he'd prefer that his wife be in possession of a firearm if she ever needed it. A big claim is that gun shows are the source of firearms by criminals. What you've never heard is that the United States Department of Justice actually surveyed 14,000 criminals in prisons who were put there because they had a firearm when they were arrested. 0.7 of a percentage point obtained the firearm at a gun show. 39% admitted they took it from an illegal source on the street, and another 39% said they got it from a family member or a friend. The gun show loophole is really a mythical creation of the gun ban lobby, I'm sorry. It's just like when they say other countries have passed gun control and it's the right thing to do. If you look at Britain, they made mandatory registration of everything but a long gun back in the 1920s. They came back in the 60s and said, well, now you also have to register long guns. They came back in 1997 and they mandated confiscation of all those firearms. Ever since their initial ban, the homicide rate has averaged 52% higher than the onset of the original ban, and 15% higher since they confiscated all the firearms. Looking at Chicago, to look at somewhere closer to home, in 1982, Chicago banned handguns. They have averaged 40% higher murder rates in Chicago since banning guns. And since in 2005, 96% of those people that were murdered were done so with a handgun. But they were all banned, so where did that come from? I apologize, my speech is a little long. I thought we had 10 minutes initially, so I'll concede the time.
Okay, thank you. Sorry to cut you off, but I think we should give Ms. Hoover an opportunity to speak for a few minutes.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, especially all the young people. It's great to see you here, even if you were made to come. It's still good that you're here and that you can hear all of it and debate it when you go back. I am Toby Hoover. I am the Executive Director of the Ohio Coalition Against Gun Violence. I also serve on the National Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence's Board of Directors. I serve on the States United to Prevent Gun Violence's Board of Directors. I feel like I have my back to these people. I think it's interesting, some of the things that Jeff brings up, because it was part of what I wanted to tell you, and that is that I have been a volunteer on this issue since 1973. And I've been working with the organization that we formed in 1995 as a volunteer again until the year 2000. Since the year 2000, I have had national funding off and on to do educational work. The big difference between Jeff's organization and ours is that his is a lobbying organization. Ours is not, and not allowed to be except for a small portion, of which our national funding did not allow. So we're sort of not talking apples and apples here when we're talking some of those things. And if I amortized it, and you could ask my husband to confirm, I've probably made about 5 cents an hour over those years. So the amount of money coming in is for different purposes. So glad to be able to clear that up. And I've been very active, and then maybe not so active sometimes. Been almost full-time since the year of 2000. Our main reason for forming our organization was because a young person was gunned down in the city of Toledo. And faith groups came together, and community groups came together and said, enough is enough, we ought to be doing something. At that very same time, it was the time that Carry Conceal was introduced. And that was back in 94, 95. And so we proceeded to work with them, tweak it, say, you know, this isn't what we want, and that went on until it passed in 2004. We still oppose concealed carry. We think that it is not in the best interest of the common good, and I think that's probably one of the biggest differences that you will hear between Jeff and I, is that usually one side is talking about the rights of the individual, what they can do, why they need to have their gun. The other side is talking about the common good and what's good for everyone. And unfortunately, that means that sometimes the individual has to do some things that are going to be not quite so easy, because it's for the common good to make it not quite as acceptable. There are many, many things that are going on right now. The CCW fight was an interesting one. The recent preemption fight was an interesting one, because the state has now decided that there are no cities that can pass their own laws. And even if we weren't talking about guns, how many people would think it was a great idea if the state said, you as a democracy and your city can no longer rule yourself, that you can only do what we allow? Probably not very many. And so what they did with this particular one was talk about it like it was only about concealed carry. Preemption actually preempted laws all over the state of Ohio on a lot of different parts of the firearm issue, many of which, maybe most of which, we don't have any laws in the state of Ohio. So they're actually saying you can't have anything stronger in your city than you do in your state. But, oh, by the way, we don't have anything that rules that in our state. So by the time that it made it to the Ohio Supreme Court, it got a little bit distorted because there was a lawsuit in between about something the city of Clyde did specifically on concealed carry. By the Supreme Court issue was that it was talking about everything with guns, whether, adults could let children have them. It was talking about assault weapons. It was talking about how you sell them. There specifically said in that passage of that bill that you couldn't do anything. And so we objected to that on a lot of different bases, including the fact that in Ohio, home rule is very important and that we think that localities ought to be able to do that. I think most recently, I would feel like I was neglecting something if I didn't address what has happened in Arizona and what may or may not become of it, because it was an interesting experience for me to watch it happen. I don't usually have my TV on Saturday morning, but I do get a notice on my phone that tells me that there's a CNN bulletin. I looked, it said there was a shooting. I turned on the television. And as I turned on that television and I started to listen to them tell me what was happening, I just stood there and kept saying, again, it's happened again, and found myself in tears. Because one of the most important reasons why I have withstood this all of these years, and I do say withstand it because sometimes the discussions are not this polite. Would you agree with that, Jeff?
Oh, absolutely.
and that was a nice way of putting it. But I've been able to do that because I myself lost someone that I loved 38 years ago. And I have to tell you, and I don't know how many people, usually when I'm giving a talk someplace, I ask the audience participation of how many people know someone that has been injured or killed by a gun. And the reality of when you're watching it unfold to other people, that you're reliving what happened to you as well. And I watched that happen, and I'm always surprised by my own reactions of that I'm still, knowing how those people feel, and knowing what's going to happen next, and knowing how they're going to react when someone tells them their loved one did not survive. And so, of course, everybody was watching it. I would imagine that Jeff was watching it as much as I was. And we proceeded to see, how could this continue to happen with, we're not doing anything about this. What can we do about this are always the questions. And how will we be stopped from doing anything that makes any common sense? Within a few weeks, I was called and I participated in a news conference a week ago in New York City with Mayor Bloomberg. And his point was for the whole thing was that everybody watches it on television when it's a group, when it's Columbine, when it's Virginia Tech, when it's Fort Hood, and now when it's Arizona. And especially because it was a U.S. representative and because it was a judge and because it was a 9-year-old child. But then nobody pays any attention the rest of the time to the 9-year-old children. Nobody pays any attention to the other people who die every day. And so 34 of us to represent, and the figure varies, 32, 34 of us, went to New York to say, this happens every day. Tomorrow there will be 32 more victims. The next day there will be 32 more. And so it's not something we can ignore. So our plea at this point is, will everybody please sit down at the table and see what we can do? The answer is not, we can't do anything. The answer is not that it is absolute from the Second Amendment that everybody can have whatever they please, whenever they please, and take it wherever they please. There are limitations, even after all of the years when both the decisions were made in the last couple of years about individual rights. They clearly said that there could and probably should be regulations on firearms. So that's not the issue. And Ohio has had that ruling individual right for years and years and years. Also not absolute.
I think that's probably a good place to start opening up the conversation a little bit. Thank you both for your remarks. And Jeff, let me start where Toby left off and pick up on one of the remarks you made, which was the posting on the Huffington blog, which listed a number of restrictions on gun rights that you listed. One of the ones you specifically listed was restrictions on high magazine clips, and that's one that's very much in the news in the last month since the shootings in Arizona. Is that a type of reasonable restriction on firearms that you're prepared to accept?
No, and let me explain why. The capacity of a magazine and the definition of a high-capacity magazine is an arbitrary number thrown around that really has no impact on how much carnage a mad person doing something crazy like what took place in Tucson can accomplish. Well, back when the assault weapons ban was in place and there was a 10-round capacity on new manufactured firearms, we still had substantially thousands of magazines in the United States that were capable of holding higher capacity rounds. So despite this ban, you could always go out and obtain a previously manufactured high-capacity magazine. Now, to say that if we had an actual ban on the capacity, and would it have done anything in Tucson? First of all, in my opinion, that's like saying the first 10 people that were shot were acceptable casualties, and I think that's absolutely false. What took place there could have been done with smaller capacity magazines by using multiple firearms. We've seen that in Virginia Tech. We've seen that at Columbine. Just coming back to saying that if we reduce the number, it's somehow going to prevent something, it's not. It's just using the tragedy to try to enact another gun control law.
Well, let me pick up on one of Jeff's comments for you, Toby, and that is that, as he points out, firearms are durable goods. In fact, there's functioning firearms that go back 100 years or certainly 50 years or more. Isn't that a very practical limitation on what any community or any state can do in terms of enacting gun control regulations?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I know what you're asking me.
Well, how practical is it, knowing that firearms are designed to be operated for a very long period of time? And as Jeff points out, that when there were restrictions on high magazine clips in the past, you have, we could enact that restriction today in the wake of what happened in Arizona, but there's going to be any number of guns or ammunition, et cetera, that would not be within that simply because it was manufactured today or 10 years ago and it remains on the market. And isn't that a practical limitation, particularly since most firearms are particularly mobile and particularly able to be sort of hidden, for lack of a better word?
It certainly is a problem and a challenge, but I think to look at it clearly is that there is, and I told you the number of places that I'm connected to, there is no one asking to ban guns. And so it's not on the table. It seems like a waste of time to even be talking about that kind of thing. On the other hand, the large capacity magazines could possibly have saved some lives. Nobody ever thinks of, let's do something and this will be a cure-all that will fix everything. Certainly, the first one shot was enough. So it didn't make any difference if 19 were shot in Arizona. But if we look at, who needs a clip that can hold from 30 on up for safety, for sport, then we say, again, we go back to the common good and say, what are you willing to do to see with those that have intent can't get a hold of that kind of firepower? There are people out there that have the intent of, this young man did. He was well armed when he went there. And so can we do some things that will make it more difficult for him to be able to have that kind of firepower with him?
Well, let me stick with you for a minute and pick up on the comment about the common good you just made and made in your opening remarks as well. You gave that as a reason for opposing the concealed carry legislation. That's been the law in Ohio for a few years now, and I think we all remember the debates about that and what one side and the other said the consequences would be. It doesn't seem like the sky has really fallen, or am I missing something on that? I mean, what's the case today for repealing the legislation?
Well, I think what everybody missed was that there were a lot of words that were assumed that people said, and a lot of words that were put in a lot of our mouths, and nobody ever thought that it was going to become this big disaster. What we said was that it wasn't going to save anything either, and that there were the majority of us, the absolute majority of adults in Ohio, that didn't want to carry concealed and didn't particularly want to be sitting next to the person who was at the movie theater or the park or at the ball game, and that because it depended upon that person's decision making of what could happen when something, and you had that happen right here in Cleveland, where you had a couple of concealed carry people, and one didn't like the fact that they couldn't have the other one's parking place, etc., and you had a shooting. So you had a person who may have not had intent the day before, but under the circumstances of anger, it ended up in disaster. Those are the kind of things that we were looking at. They are tracking them for the last couple of years nationally. There have been at least 280 incidences of people that have their licenses that have committed a crime. Now, while I'm saying that, before they all go home and email me real quick and tell me that they're not the bad guys, that's not what that's saying. You know, certainly there are some fine people that have decided to make this I'm going to be nice and say this poor decision to be able to carry everywhere. But everyone doesn't agree, and in Ohio we have about 11.5 million people. We have about 7.5 million adults that would be at the right age that they could get their permit to carry. And 200,000, I think, is what they're saying now that they're up to, maybe that they have that many permits. If somebody wants to do the math, that's at least under 3% of the adult population. So clearly, it's not something that everybody wants to do or thinks is a good idea.
Mr. Garvas, let me follow up on your comments about the High magazine clips and ask you whether you think that there are in fact, reasonable restrictions on Second Amendment rights that that make sense or that you'd be prepared to accept for one reason or another?
Well, yeah, I would say, to answer your question initially, there are certain things that would make sense. I mean, if we have an individual that we know for a fact is mentally unstable, that makes sense for society to say that that individual shouldn't be in possession of a firearm. But with respect to the high-capacity magazine topic, I'd like to go back to what Toby said about the benefits of concealed carry in the state of Ohio. That she said that they claimed that we wouldn't see great benefits from concealed carry in Ohio. So I want to reverse that and point it to the high-capacity magazine ban. What benefit are we going to see out of reducing the capacity of a magazine? Anyone who is intent on doing something wrong is going to either bring multiple firearms with limited capacity magazines, or they're going to manufacture a magazine. They're going to do something to make that do what they want. So it really turns the question around. Instead of asking, what are we as a community willing to, quote unquote, give up, as Toby kind of puts it, I think that we need to ask the same question she's asking of what concealed carry offers and say, what is a magazine capacity ban going to do? It wouldn't have done anything. There's nothing that you could gain from that.
This may be an opportunity for our break before we open up to questions from the audience.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday Forum featuring Jeff Garvas, founder and president of Ohioans for Concealed Carry, and Toby Hoover, executive director of the Ohio Coalition Against Gun Violence. We'll return to our speakers in a minute for the traditional City Club questions. So please start formulating your questions now, and please remember that they should be brief and to the point. No speeches. Please focus on asking a specific question. Members and guests alike are welcome to attend City Club forums, and we certainly hope that everyone listening will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. Please visit our website, www.cityclub.org, to see a full schedule of our upcoming programs. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We are very pleased to welcome guests today at tables hosted by the law firm Baker & Hostetler and Western Reserve Friends of the NRA. Thank you for joining us today. We are also very pleased to host students at our forum today who are here as part of our City Club student program. Participation of these students is made possible by a generous grant from the Fred E. Scholl Foundation, Bernard L. Carr, chairman. With us today are students from Christian Community School, Carl F. Schuler Academy, Westlake High School, Ledgemont High School, Aurora High School, and the Arts Academy. Will our students please stand and be recognized? I'm sure we'll have some great questions from some of you. And now we would like to return to our speakers for a traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Development Associate Lucille Barbati and City Club Program Director Kerry Miller. First question, please.
This question is addressed to Mr. Garvas, a gentleman who's in favor of carrying concealed weapons. There was reference made today to the horrible shooting in Arizona just last month, at which time 6 people were killed and a dozen were badly injured. The man who did the shooting was a very confirmed mental case with severe mental problems. He'd been expelled from school, and he also had a record of mental illness. To what extent do you think our gun laws should be significantly changed so people with that kind of an ailment could not purchase a gun? How we go about that, and what laws should be changed in your judgment?
Well, I think that we have a system in place to prevent people that are mentally, deemed to be mentally challenged, mentally incapacitated. The problem is, and this is widely discussed openly, is that the information isn't populated up to the federal database, so that when he purchased that firearm, if he was in fact adjudicated mentally incompetent, then that database may or may not have known about it. And the reason is because in our country we respect privacy rights. And because of laws like HIPAA, sometimes doctors are prohibited from passing that information up, or state laws prohibit it from being passed up. But to get to the answer to your question, I see an opportunity for us to improve the way that doctors and mental health professionals populate a database that puts that information in a position where people can be potentially prohibited from making those purchases. But at the same time, we need to respect privacy rights, and we need to also have an appeals process.
What about requiring people who wish to purchase weapons to register and to be taking a test like we do for a driver's license? I mean, you even have to get a license to get married, although you don't have to take a test.
Mr. Garvas?
And I apologize, was this specifically to just purchasing or for the purposes of carrying? Okay.
Well, you have to own it first in order to be able to carry it.
Right. In Ohio today, we do require people to take mandatory training and to go through a background check and to literally take a test to carry in Ohio. Do I think that we should make people take a test to buy a firearm? Absolutely not. You have a right to buy a firearm in the United States. There is nothing out there that says that you have to take a test if you want to go out and become a journalist and write. This is a cherished right in the United States, and I don't think that we should put in front of people government restrictions that say, yes, I need to prove that I have the right to exercise my rights. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Ms. Hoover, I suspect you may have slightly different views about the efficacy of such laws.
I think so. I was glad to hear both of those questions. The first question is I'm delighted to hear that Jeff is going to be working with us on tightening up the background checks in this country, because that is one of the things that nationally everybody is looking at. The reason they're not working is because the federal government passed the laws so we can enforce those laws that you're always talking about. We just need to enforce the laws we have. We would like to do that, but the money has not been there for the states to get all of these systems up to par. And the other important part is for us not to fall into the trap of saying these shootings, we have to put up with them because there's just, quote, crazy people out there. This young man has not been proven, although he did something that we all feel is a very crazy thing, has not been proven that he's mentally ill, and it is very specific about which mental illness can be put into this database. The lady's question that I'm supposed to be following up on is the fact that do you think there ought to be some testing and some accountability and some responsibility for someone who wants to own a product that its purpose is to shoot things and kill things? Some sporting put aside. The majority of time that we're talking about crimes in this country, we're talking about it's done with guns. And if the people who want to have them would take the responsibility for them, we would not only have training, we would have licensing and registration. And then they would be responsible for that gun. And we do not have that.
Hello, my name is Rosie Craig, and I have a question for Jeff. I was wondering how many wakes or funerals you have attended of a victim of gun violence, and if you haven't, would you be willing to go with me and Toby Hoover to another one that occurs?
I don't understand how that's a question related to the gun control debate, but I've met many people that have been victims of gun violence, the survivors of the gun violence. One particularly that comes to mind is Nikki Gozer. She's a young lady from Tennessee who was being stalked, and she knew she was being stalked. She had a restraining order against the man that was stalking her, and because of laws in Tennessee, she was in a place that prohibited her from being in possession of the firearm that she typically carried because of her stalker. And her stalker tracked her down when she was counties away from where she normally lived and murdered her husband right in front of her. And I think that when you look at the gun control debate, there's two different mindsets. We have victims of shootings that will turn their life into trying to fight for what they believe is right in the form of gun control. And if you look at Nikki Gozer, which we happen to have all kinds of video of her on our YouTube channel, she's testified in Ohio, despite being a Tennessee resident, to try to reform our laws because of what she's gone through. And the mindset of what I was trying to get to there is that Toby's fighting for gun control because of what she's experienced in her life. But Nikki Gozer is fighting for allowing people to be in a situation where they can potentially defend themselves. So to say that there aren't people on both sides of that issue that have experienced loss, I think wouldn't be an accurate statement at all.
Would you be willing to go to a wake?
Let's go to the next question, please.
Please.
Right over here.
My question is for Mr. Garvas. It sounded like at the beginning when you said that gun laws that law-abiding citizens follow the laws and criminals don't. It almost sounds as if you're saying, so therefore we shouldn't have any laws whatsoever because the criminals aren't going to follow them anyway. You know, is that really what you're saying? And then to also say, well, gee, if we only have 10 rounds in a magazine, well, then they'll have 3-4 guns with them. And how about trying some of these things? They are proved in other states that have tougher laws. There's less crimes, there's less killings with guns. It doesn't sound like you agree that we should even try these things because the criminals won't do anything about, they'll still be doing the illegal things. Is that what you're really saying?
To answer your question, I guess maybe to clarify what I was trying to say is that the notion that another gun law would have potentially prohibited Loeffner from doing what he did is really an exercise in futility. If you would have said that he could only have had a 10-round magazine, or that anybody in the country could only have a 10-round magazine, then you're saying that the first 10 shots that he took were acceptable in a certain sense. I don't believe that that's an accurate statement. I also don't believe that there's evidence in other states that this is true. If you look at Chicago, when Chicago banned handguns citywide, and when Washington banned handguns citywide for 30-some years, their murder rate has skyrocketed. So when we argue that more gun laws is somehow going to be a preventative measure, all gun laws typically tend to do when there's the penalty phase is they punish someone after the fact for doing something that they shouldn't have done in the first place. Gun laws don't work as a preventative measure against people that are committed to commit a crime. If you were to somehow unring the bell of guns in the United States and make them all disappear, people that are intent on doing bad things would do them with other instruments. They would use bats. They might use knives. In fact, if you look down in Akron, just the past last month, I believe it was, there was a serial robbery suspect that was robbing gas stations and convenience stores using a knife. And he just happened to be stopped by someone possessing a firearm on his third or fourth situation. So, going back to the question that was asked earlier in terms of registration, Cleveland has had registration for years. What has it done to prevent all of the shootings that take place on an annual basis in Cleveland? Are we going to start registering purchasing kitchen knives? What's that going to prevent? To argue that passing a gun law that I'm going to follow is going to somehow prevent a Loeffner or the Virginia Tech shooter from buying multiple firearms, or the Columbine kids from buying multiple firearms, it's really not something that has ever been proven to prevent any type of crime.
I have a question for Mr. Garvas. What are you so afraid of having a license? Why would that be so wrong? If you're a responsible gun owner, and I know there are probably many in this room who think, I have a gun, I keep it locked up, I don't want young kids getting around it, it would probably be a good thing to have a license for it. If you're responsible, we all have one to drive a car, so why not? I mean, why not?
Well, I think the answer to your question is that we don't need a license to buy a car. We need a license to drive it on the street. We need to buy license plates to pay for the roads that we drive on. But if you technically went to a dealership and tried to buy a vehicle and take it home with you, you wouldn't have to have a license, you wouldn't have to have a license plate. To argue that I'm afraid of anything is really misconstruing the point. I actually have a license. I have it here in my pocket. I have a license to carry a handgun in the state of Ohio. I'm not afraid of having a license. I'm not afraid of people that possess firearms that I don't know. It's really not about fear. It's more about protection, and it's more about preparedness. I have a fire extinguisher in my house because I'm concerned that there might be a fire in my kitchen. I carry a firearm because I might one day find myself in a position where I may need to use it. Now, on a preference point of view, I hope I never have to use it. I hope nobody that I know that carries a firearm ever has to use it. But to say that I'm afraid is really misconstruing the point.
This is a question for both of you. The Tucson case, part of it was somebody who had a weapon drew down on the wrong person and it committed in the newspaper, he nearly fired at the wrong person. So I'm wondering, for both of you, like the idea that having a weapon actually leads to is more dangerous than people who don't have weapons. And like both of you respond in this context of Tucson, where somebody admitted that they almost shot the wrong person when they were subduing Loeffner. How you respond to that, like how that, how you respond to that.
Ms. Hoover, why don't you take that?
I'm glad to have that question, thank you. I thought that was very interesting because the young man that was carrying the concealed weapon was humble enough to say, I'm very, very lucky, because I could have made a terrible mistake. By the time that he got to the scene, there was a man holding the gun, but it was not the shooter. It was the man who had taken the gun away from the shooter. And he was about to draw his gun and shoot that man. And so he admitted he had a half a second to make this decision. He had his hand on his gun. And the other important part is that the other reason that he didn't take his gun out was he was afraid that he too would have been thought of as one of the shooters. So there's, that I got a lot of criticism at times from the gun side of this issue when it passed and we said, assume if you see somebody with a gun that they mean to harm, because you don't have any way of knowing who the good guys and the bad guys are. And so that would have been another one of those cases. He didn't know. Here it was the guy that stopped the Arizona shooter, but he had a gun in his hand. And so this young man didn't know. He could have shot him. And I think that we were all very lucky that it didn't get worse. And those circumstances like Arizona don't happen every day, thank goodness, although they're getting much too frequent. What we failed, it always seems to talk about is that Jeff wants to carry because he's afraid of what might happen someday and he might have to use his weapon. Then he assumes that he's going to be proficient enough, more so than law enforcement officers, that he's going to be successful. When we're looking at, what about, Rosie's asking you to go to a funeral with us, what about one of the cases where the man in the family has been a law-abiding gun owner, had his gun for years, but now there's a divorce going on and he decides to kill the children and himself? How about let's go to that one and say, why did this happen? Why did we allow guns to be so accessible that when people are distraught and have a problem, that they can get to it that easy and use it against people that they love. And if we watch the newspapers, we need to be concerned about a whole lot more than what gang is shooting what gang or what robber is doing what. We need to look at what's happening within the home and between friends as well.
Can I react to that?
Oh, sure.
Do we have a name of the individual that we're claiming drew a gun in Arizona?
I could probably find it.
There's I don't have the name of the individual either that I'm thinking of, but I've seen a video of this person who was on the Ed Show, I believe it was on MSNBC, and if we're talking about the same individual, I don't think he said anything that was just presented to us here. The individual in question that I saw on MSNBC said that he was leaving the grocery store, heard the gunshots, drew his pistol, and walked back in. And he quickly determined that he didn't need his pistol, so he quickly reholstered it. It's similar to an incident that happened down in Columbus where a man was robbed at an ATM, drew his pistol, and came to the rapid decision that he didn't need to use it, so he reholstered it as the guy that was robbing him fled the scene. When we make this unsubstantiated claim that people are going to not be able to make a decision, we're ignoring the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of defensive uses of a pistol annually. There are, from all kinds of different reports, supposedly 1 or 2 people that were in that grocery store in Tucson that had a firearm. Both of them didn't use it because they realized that the escalation of force wasn't necessary. A large group of people acted in a way to tackle the shooter at an opportune time. So I think that that's something we need to look at. The people that were armed knew they didn't need to do anything. But to claim that they might have done something wrong or there could have been a tragedy is really speculation more so than anything meaningful.
Well, you may have beat me a little bit to my question. Your answer may beat my question a little bit. But Ms. Hoover said during her presentation that when she saw the Arizona shooting, she thought, we aren't doing anything about this. And I thought, we are doing something about this. We're allowing people to get extensive training and then carry firearms in order to protect themselves and others against criminals who would do them harm. And so I was wondering, Mr. Garvas, if you have any information or statistics on how many times private citizens, in particular perhaps with those with concealed carry permits, have used firearms either to deter crimes, to stop criminals from hurting others or themselves, or to apprehend criminals. And then I would ask Ms. Hoover, if in fact it's true that that has happened, wouldn't you agree that those incidents are in fact to the common good, which you have been talking about?
Go ahead.
Actually, that's a really good question, and the statistics are at both ends of the spectrum. But the opponents of gun rights claim that the number is somewhere in the 400 to 500,000 range, and the high end is somewhere in the 2 million times a year range. The problem with trying to report an accurate, exact number of how many times a firearm is used in self-defense is really hard to come to, because if you go to any police department or any law enforcement agency, when you deter a crime, when you prevent a crime in any means, if you did it because you walked away, if you did it because you drew a firearm and didn't fire a shot and everything came to an end, that no crime took place that would be reported other than the potential crime that would indicate that a firearm was involved. So there's no hard statistics in our country that can argue other than looking at news media reports and that. Now, to get back to your common good question, I think it's absolutely a common good. It really doesn't matter how many people, and let's just use this room as an example. Let's say some quantity of people in this room chose to carry concealed. It wouldn't matter what quantity chose to carry concealed, because nobody knows who's carrying concealed. So from a common good perspective, society knows that someone that they might target could potentially be armed. And there are a lot of interviews that you can find all over the internet of convicted criminals who admit that their greatest fear is encountering someone that's armed when they're trying to victimize them. We like to refer to it as a critical failure in the victim selection process. It's totally in the benefit of the common good that citizens as a whole have the right to carry firearms. At the same time, we also need to respect the fact that some people either have no interest, or they're afraid of them, or they just don't want to, or it's just inconvenient for their lives. But yeah, definitely in the common good.
Toby, what about that point on the common good?
Well, the common good is maybe more a way of thinking about self and what one person is going to do in society and living with everybody else. And that means I may have to do some things that are not real convenient for me. I might not even know that they make a whole lot of sense to me. I happen to think I'm a pretty good driver, and so I think I could drive faster than what that speed limit says. And yet I'm perfectly willing to abide by what that says for the common good, because everybody can drive a little safer. That's just a little bit of a flippant answer to that. But our core purposes of how we are living need to be based on how can we sit down and see what else we can do. And you happen to believe, via your question, that we're doing a lot of good for the common good because people are walking around with guns. And yet, that's about 3% of the people. And when you include those people, you're also including a lot of people that have had no training whatsoever across the country, because we have all these reciprocal agreements. And in some states, you can get them over the internet, and you can have a little card to carry like Jeff has. And so then that gives that person a right to carry in the state of Ohio. So, I mean, the laws themselves get so complicated that you can go on and on and on. But I maintain that the easy accessibility to a gun is not in the common good, where most people are gathered in public at the discretion of somebody that's going to make that kind of decision, and that the numbers cannot be verified, because I never see anybody on the front page or down at the police department saying, I just prevented a crime because I drew my gun. There is no record of these things. They're based on a few instances that does happen, and then they go from there, and it ends up this large number.
We have another question over here.
Mr. Garvas, how would you feel if this group here today, the Cleveland City Club, were allowed to come in and carry firearms, and why?
How would I apologize if I misunderstood the question. How would I feel if everyone in here could be in possession of a firearm?
That's exactly what I said.
Okay.
If everyone here had firearms, were allowed to come into the City Club,
Mm-hmm.
and why would you feel that way?
I think it's a question about safety in public spaces,
right.
Whether we're in downtown Cleveland
right.
or elsewhere.
To be honest with you, I feel that it would be in the safest building in this block of downtown Cleveland, because there's a certain amount of understanding that comes with being in possession of a firearm. Sometimes it's overly generalized that we're all just too dumb to own a gun. We don't have enough training. I, for one, actually have more training than most police officers get, just because it's an interest to me. Now, at the same time, we have mandatory training in the state of Ohio for carrying concealed. I've been in engagements where 200 plus people have been armed, and I see nothing wrong with it. It's like saying, do you not feel safe walking into a police station? There's a large quantity of people in that police station that are armed. Do you not feel safe walking into a courthouse? There's a large number of bailiffs and others that are armed. For saying that if this whole room were armed, I wouldn't have any problem with that whatsoever. Not at all.
Ms. Hoover?
I'll answer it very shortly. I wouldn't be here. Because I've received too many emails and letters and telephone calls that have threatened to me for what I do, and they tell me that they are concealed carry holders. And so, therefore, if they were all sitting here with gun on their hip and as angry as they get with me, I wouldn't be here.
I think we have time for one more question over here.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you both for your talks. I have a question for both of you. When I read the amicus briefs in the Supreme Court case of D.C. versus Heller, I noted there was a brief by the Jews for the Preservation of Firearm Ownership, and it documented millions of illegal killings of citizens by governments who were disarmed ostensibly by reasonable gun control regulations. And I wondered if you'd both comment on that.
Toby, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I think that's how we always end up at a place where we can't move forward, because for some reason or other, that kind of language, how clear it is within the actual lawsuit or not, sort of clouds everybody's judgment that it's going to have something to do with taking everybody's guns away. And that it's not the question, it's not the answer, it's not on the table. The Heller and the McDonald cases have been settled to say that you have an individual right, meaning no one can ban everybody's guns. So we should be finished talking about that.
And I think we are finished talking. I'm sorry, Mr. Garvas, we're out of time.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been listening to Jeff Garvas, President of Ohioans for Concealed and Carry, and Toby Hoover, Executive Director of Ohioans Against Gun Violence. Thank you, Mr. Garvas and Ms. Hoover. Your remarks were very informative. Thank you, Mr. Calabrese, for moderating. Thank you, for ladies and gentlemen, for participating. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.